60 investors watched in silence as I knelt in shattered glass and stunned honeybees, my own son's voice cracking through a microphone. "This man doesn't belong at my company's launch." What none of them knew, not even my son, though he'd found proof of his wife's fraud 3 days earlier and said nothing, was that the patent keeping that company alive belonged to me. So why did I let it happen? I want to tell you exactly what falling looks like at 74. It looks like this one knee buckling first, the wrist snapping out too late to catch the weight, and then the display case. 3 feet of reinforced glass built to hold 12 queen bee colonies for a press photograph, tilting sideways under my shoulder. The glass didn't break clean. It spiderwebbed, then gave, and $40,000 of custom hive engineering came down with me onto the ballroom floor of the Marchmont Hotel. The bees came out confused, not angry. That distinction mattered to me even then on the floor, glass biting through my trouser knee. Confused bees don't sting. Angry ones do. I had spent 50 years learning the difference, and some part of my brain kept cataloging it, while the rest of me tried to figure out which direction was up. 200 feet away, under a banner that read, "Cascade Bloom Technologies Series B Launch," my son Garrett stood at a podium, holding a microphone he had rehearsed with for a week. He saw me go down. I know because the room's whole attention followed his eyes before it followed the sound of the glass. And instead of crossing that floor, instead of doing the one thing a son does when his father hits the ground in front of 60 strangers, Garrett said the words that would follow both of us for the rest of our lives. "Everyone, please, this is not part of the program." A pause long enough that I heard it even face down. "This man doesn't belong at my company's launch." He didn't say Dad. He said this man. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision is the only thing I have ever been good at. Nobody moved toward me. 60 investors in dark suits held their champagne and watched a 74-year-old man try to get his hands out from under broken glass alone. My daughter-in-law Priya stood 4 feet from where I'd fallen, close enough that her heel had been the last thing my eyes tracked before the floor came up to meet me. She did not offer a hand either. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I know because I counted them, the way I count everything. A habit from 40 years of measuring things that mattered less than this. A young man in a Marchmont uniform, maybe 22, broke from the catering line before anyone else moved. He crouched and cleared the glass from around my hands with his bare fingers and said nothing at all. His name tag read Teo. I never forgot it. I got my good knee under me first. Then the other one, which had never fully forgiven a ladder fall from 19 years ago, and made its opinion known now in language no doctor needed to translate. Standing took longer than it should have. Nobody in that room offered a chair. When I was finally upright, I looked for my son's face and found something on it I didn't recognize. Not shame, not concern, something colder, already rehearsing how this would be explained tomorrow. "Garrett," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Is that really what you think of me?" He didn't answer. He looked at Priya instead, the way a man checks a script he didn't write himself. I straightened my jacket. Dark tweed, 31 years old. The kind of coat 60 investors in that room had clearly never seen up close before tonight. I did not brush the glass from my sleeve in front of them. I let it show. "Good," I said loud enough to carry. "Now I know exactly where I stand." I turned and walked toward the service exit at the far end of the ballroom, past round tables where nobody had stood up, past ice sculptures shaped like beehives that Priya's event planner had commissioned for $11,000, past the enormous screens still looping drone footage of orchards in bloom, Cascade Bloom's entire pitch, built on fields that existed only because of contracts with my name buried 3 signatures deep in paperwork none of those investors had ever asked to see. A waiter held the service door open without being told to. I walked through it. The door swung shut behind me, and the ballroom noise, the low murmur that follows every public humiliation, once the audience decides it's safe to talk again, dropped to almost nothing on the other side of the wall. I stood alone in a service hallway that smelled like industrial dish soap. my knee announcing itself with every heartbeat, glass still caught somewhere in the weave of my trousers. My hands were shaking. Not from the fall. From something that had been building for 18 months and had finally publicly arrived. Understand something about me before I go any further with this. I am not a man who explains himself twice, and I am not a man who forgives an insult by accident. Everything that happened in that ballroom that night, the trip, the glass, the words my son chose in front of 60 strangers, had been set in motion 3 weeks earlier by a phone call I almost didn't answer. I need to take you back to that call. Because the woman who tripped me into a display case worth $40,000 had spent 18 months building a case that I was no longer fit to run my own affairs. And my son, the one who told a room full of investors that I didn't belong there, had already found proof 3 days before that night, proof about his wife, not about me, and told absolutely no one. 1 day before the fall. At 10 minutes to 6 in the morning, my phone rang, and an 11-year-old girl told me to be careful. The call lasted 90 seconds. 40 of them were silence. My phone rang at 10 minutes to 6, the screen lighting up the dark kitchen before I'd even finished pouring the coffee. Ren. 11 years old, and she never called before school unless something was wrong. She'd told me that herself months earlier. Like a rule she'd made for both of us without asking. Grandpa. Her voice came through in the particular thinness of a kid talking with her hand cupped around the phone. Morning, sweetheart. You're up early? I wanted to catch you before you left for Portland. A pause. Not the pause of a kid deciding what to say next, the pause of a kid deciding how much. I'm not leaving for another few hours, I said. What's going on? Nothing, Another pause, this one longer. I could hear something in the background, a door maybe, or a drawer sliding shut 2 rooms away from wherever she was hiding to make this call. Be careful tonight, okay? Careful how you... Just careful. Her voice shifted then fast into something brighter and flatter, at the same time the tone of a kid switching scripts because someone had walked into the room. I mean, drive safe. It's supposed to rain in Portland. I saw it on the weather thing. I know my granddaughter. I have known her for 11 years, which is not a long time by most measures, but it is long enough to learn the difference between a child telling you something and a child performing the telling of something for an audience that just arrived. Ren. I gotta go, Grandpa, the bus. And she hung up before I could say anything else. I stood in my kitchen holding a phone that had gone dark in my hand, and I thought about 3 things in order. First, Ren had never in her life called the school bus the bus. She called it Bus 14 because she'd ridden it since kindergarten, and she was proud of knowing its number. Second, it does not rain in Portland in April, any more than it rains anywhere else in the Willamette Valley in April. Which is to say, it rains constantly, and an 11-year-old does not need a weather app to know that. Third, somebody had walked into that room. I set the phone down and finished pouring the coffee I'd started before the call because a man learns at 74 which problems can be solved standing still and which ones require you to keep moving while you think. Here is what I knew for certain standing in that kitchen. My son's company was launching its Series B round that night at a hotel in Portland, in front of 60 investors who had never met me and did not know my name, belonged to a single line item in the paperwork that made their investment possible. My daughter-in-law had called me 3 weeks earlier to invite me personally in a voice I did not entirely believe. And now my granddaughter had called before sunrise to tell me to be careful, then walked that warning back in the space of 1 sentence. I called my son. It rang 4 times before he picked up, and I could hear an office behind him printer noise, someone else's voice half a room away, the particular tight quiet of a man in the middle of something he didn't want interrupted. Hey, Dad, can't really talk right now. Ren called me this morning, I said. Before school. A beat. Okay. She told me to be careful tonight. Another beat longer than the first. Kids say stuff, Dad. She's probably just nervous about the launch. It's a big night. She's never been nervous about a launch before. Look, I really can't get into this right now. I've got investors calling in 20 minutes. His voice had the particular clipped edge it got when he was managing me instead of talking to me. a tone I had started noticing more over the last year and liked less each time. "You're still coming tonight, right?" I said I would. "Good. That's good." A pause, and something in it almost cracked open into a different sentence before he shut it again. "I'll see you there, Dad." He hung up first. I stood at the counter a while longer, not moving, the coffee going lukewarm in my hand. Understand something about how I was built. 50 years of managing bee colonies teaches you to read agitation before it becomes a problem, a change in the pitch of the hum, a shift in how the guards cluster near the entrance, small signals that mean nothing on their own and everything together. I had heard 3 small signals in 11 minutes. A granddaughter who walked back her own warning, a son who wouldn't finish a sentence. And underneath both of them, a silence about my daughter-in-law that neither one of them had chosen to fill. I did not know yet what any of it meant. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy telling this now to make myself sound wiser in that kitchen than I actually was. I wasn't circling an answer. I was circling a feeling. The kind that settles into your chest before your mind is caught up to it. The kind a man my age has learned not to argue with, even when he can't yet defend it. I thought about calling Wren back and decided against it. Whatever she'd almost told me, she'd chosen not to say it over a phone that wasn't private, which meant somebody in that house was listening closely enough that an 11-year-old had learned to watch her words. That told me more than the words themselves would have. I went out to the truck 2 hours later than I needed to, because I wanted time to think, and driving has always done that for me better than sitting still. I did not know, pulling out of the driveway past the first pale blossoms opening on the orchard rows, that I already had every piece of the answer I would need that night. I just didn't have them arranged yet. I had one stop to make before Portland. 15 years earlier, in a lawyer's office, 2 hours from where I stood, I had signed a set of documents I had never once needed to think about again until tonight, when some instinct older than reason told me to go back and read them one more time before I walked into that ballroom. Harlan Voss had been my lawyer for 22 years, and in all that time, I had never once shown up at his office without an appointment. He didn't look surprised to see me anyway. He came out from behind his desk, took one look at my face, and said, "You want to see the file?" "I want to see the file." He didn't ask why. That was the thing about Harlan. He had built an entire career on knowing which questions to skip. He pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet, the tabs color-coded in a system only he understood, and set it on the table between us without ceremony. "Everything's exactly where it was the day we filed it," he said. "Trust intact, controlling interest documented. Nothing anyone can touch without your signature. You know that." "I know it," I said. "I wanted to hear you say it out loud." He studied me for a moment, deciding whether to ask the next question. "Something happen?" "Not yet," I said. "Maybe nothing happens at all. But if my son's wife calls you in the next few weeks asking questions about my competency or my estate or anything that sounds like it's dressed up as concern for my well-being, I want you to remember this conversation." Harlan's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. He'd been doing this long enough to know that the calmest-sounding requests were usually the ones that mattered most. "Understood," he said. "You want me to reach out to anyone in the meantime? Simone Achterberg, maybe the board chair, if this touches the company?" "Not yet," I said again. "Let's see what tonight actually looks like first." I left his office later than planned and got back on the highway toward Portland with the folder's contents fixed clearly in my mind. I still didn't know exactly what I was walking into, but I knew driving those last 2 hours through the rain Wren had somehow known was coming, that whatever it was, I would not be walking in unprepared. I lost my first 4 beehives in a single afternoon, and I wasn't even conscious when it happened. That's the part people never believe when I tell it. I was 34 years old, flat on a hospital bed, with a needle in my arm, and my throat still swollen half shut from a sting that should have killed me. And somewhere across town, a man I trusted signed my name to a piece of paper that gave him everything I owned. His name was Roy Kessler, my mother's younger brother. He'd been my business partner for 6 years by then, ever since I'd scraped together enough to buy my first 20 colonies, and needed someone to help run roots while I learned the science of queen breeding on the side. Roy handled the trucks and the contracts. I handled the bees. It worked, or I thought it worked, the way anything works when you've never had a reason to look closely at it. I went into anaphylactic shock on a Tuesday in June, out checking a new set of hives near Parkdale. One sting in the wrong place, at the wrong angle, and my body decided to try to kill me faster than the bee ever could have. A neighbor found me in the grass and got me to the hospital in 11 minutes, which the doctors later told me was the only reason I was still breathing. I woke up 2 days later. Roy was sitting in the chair beside my bed, and I remember being glad to see him before I understood what he was holding. "I had to make some decisions while you were out," he said. "Somebody needed to keep things running." The decisions turned out to be a full transfer of the apiary partnership into his name alone, filed with the county the day after I went under using a power of attorney I had signed 2 years earlier for an entirely different purpose. Emergency medical decisions only nothing about the business, and which Roy had quietly brought in with a lawyer he never told me he'd hired. "You weren't going to make it," he said when I finally found the strength to ask him why. "I was protecting what we built. Somebody had to." I asked him if he'd at least waited to see if I'd survive before he called the lawyer. He didn't answer that directly. What he said instead was that the lawyer had been already on retainer, a phrase that told me everything about how long he'd been planning this, or at least keeping the door open to it, without ever once mentioning it to me. I want to tell you I fought him in court and won. I didn't. I was 34, flat broke from the hospital bill, and the paperwork Roy filed was on its face entirely legal. My own signature was on the document that made it possible, even if I'd signed it for something else years before. A lawyer I couldn't afford told me plainly, "You don't have a case, you have a lesson." Here is the lesson, and I have carried it for 40 years since. Roy didn't take my hives because he was a bad man in some simple storybook way. He took them because he'd convinced himself somewhere in his own head that protecting something and owning something had become the same act. He told himself a story where stealing from an unconscious man was the responsible thing to do. And the only reason he was able to tell himself that story was because I had never once put anything in writing between us. I had trusted him the way you trust family completely, and without a single document to prove it. And that trust turned out to be the softest, easiest thing in the world to rearrange while I wasn't looking. I rebuilt from 4 rented colonies and a used truck I financed at an interest rate I'd rather not remember. It took 11 years to get back to where I'd been the day I went under, and I did every part of it with contracts. Every partnership, every land lease, every dollar anyone owed me or I owed anyone else went through a lawyer and came out the other side with both our names on something notarized. People used to tease me for it. My own wife later used to tell me I trusted paper more than I trusted people. Roy and I spoke maybe a dozen times in the 15 years between that hospital bed and his death. Never about the hives. He'd send a card at Christmas and I'd send one back, and neither of us ever wrote the sentence that actually needed writing. I went to his funeral. I don't know if that makes me generous or just tired. Some debts I've learned don't get settled. They just get old enough that carrying them costs less than putting them down. She wasn't entirely wrong. But she also didn't understand, not fully, not until much later, that I hadn't lost my trust in people that summer. I'd lost my trust in the idea that love on its own was a form of protection. Roy loved me in whatever limited way he was capable of it. He told himself right up until the day he died 15 years later that what he'd done had come from love, a need to protect the business, to protect me from my own recklessness around the hives, to protect something he believed I couldn't protect myself. Love had been sitting right there in the room the whole time. It just hadn't been enough because it had nothing behind it that could survive contact with a man convinced he was doing the right thing. I never told anyone the full truth of what I decided in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling after Roy left my throat, still raw, and my hands too weak to hold a pen. I decided that I would never again let anyone I loved hold power over what mattered to me without a paper trail standing behind it. Not because I trusted them less, but because I understood finally that the people who hurt you worst are rarely strangers. They are the ones closest enough to convince themselves they had the right. I did not know it then, but I was building in that hospital bed the exact set of instincts that would put me on a ballroom floor in Portland 40 years later. Glass in my knee, my own son's voice ringing through a microphone. Everything I built after that summer, every trust, every contract, every quiet, controlling interest I ever held without announcing it, traced back to a single afternoon I didn't even remember living through. I gave my son $340,000 before I let him finish his sentence. That's not how I remember telling it for years afterward. I like to say I'd listen to the whole pitch first, weighed it properly, the way a careful man should. The truth is messier. Garrett had barely gotten through his second sentence about distressed commercial properties before I already knew what my answer was going to be. I just let him keep talking, so he wouldn't know that. He showed up on a Saturday morning 15 years ago, 27 years old, 2 weeks out of a job he'd held since college, with a manila envelope under one arm, and the particular look of a man who has just discovered that the floor under his life was never load-bearing to begin with. I'd worn that look myself once, 40 years earlier though, for very different reasons. "Dad, I need to show you something." "Come in," I said. "I'll get coffee." He spread the pages across my kitchen table like a man laying out evidence in his own defense. Hand-drawn charts, printed market research, a business plan running 12 pages that he'd clearly built in secret over months, maybe longer. The way you build something you're afraid of being told isn't good enough. His hands weren't steady. He kept glancing up at me and back down at the pages, the same look he used to give me as a kid before admitting he'd broken something. "Real estate development," I said, reading the cover page. "Commercial and mixed use." The words came fast, rehearsed. "I know the market looks terrible right now, but that's actually the point. Distressed properties, undervalued assets. If we move now while everybody else is scared—" He stopped himself, swallowed. "I mean, if I move now." I looked at my son across that table. 27 years old, 2 weeks unemployed, hands trembling slightly over a plan he'd built without telling me, clearly braced for me to tell him it was too risky, too soon, too much. "How much do you need?" He blinked. "Dad, I haven't even finished explaining the—" "How much?" He named a figure. $340,000, his own estimate, covering 18 months of operating costs, first acquisitions, legal setup. He said it carefully, watching my face for the flinch he was clearly expecting. I nodded slowly, doing math I'd already done in my head a dozen times in the previous 10 seconds. I had that much, almost to the dollar, sitting in a retirement account I'd built, colony by colony, contract by contract, over 3 decades of never once letting a dollar move without a signature behind it. "Give me a week," I said. "I need to talk to a lawyer." His face went through something complicated. "A lawyer? Dad, why would you need a—" "Because if I'm going to put my retirement into your company," I said, "I'm going to do it correctly. Not out of love, not on a handshake, correctly." The silence after that lasted about 4 seconds, and then his eyes went red at the rims, and he looked away, toward the window, jaw working, not entirely winning the fight to keep it together. I understood something in that moment that I didn't have words for yet. That he'd expected me to say yes with my heart, the way a father is supposed to. And instead I'd said yes with my whole history, which was a very different kind of gift, and one he wouldn't understand the size of for years. I went to see Harlan that Monday morning, the folder of Garrett's paperwork under my arm, and a decision already made that I hadn't told my son about yet. I wanted my name on the money, but not on the company. I wanted him to build it believing every brick was his own, while I made certain quietly and permanently that nobody could ever do to him what Roy had done to me. "You could just give him the money outright," Harlan said, once I'd laid it out. "No structure, no trust. A gift is a gift. A gift disappears the first time someone convinces him it never happened," I said. "I want it documented. I want it protected, and I want him never to feel it." Harlan studied me the way he studied every client who asked for something more complicated than they were admitting to. "You're not just protecting the money," he said. "You're protecting him from ever having to know he needed protecting." I didn't answer that directly. Some truths sound different out loud than they do sitting quietly in your chest. And I wasn't ready yet to hear this one spoken back to me by another man. Harlan didn't push. He never did. He simply opened a fresh file, wrote August 14th at the top of a blank page. No, that date belonged to something else. And I caught myself before I said it aloud, and asked me to start from the beginning. There was a version of that morning where I told Garrett everything before I ever signed a page. I thought about it driving home afterward, watching the orchard rows blur past the truck window. I decided against it the same way I'd decided things my whole life, quietly, alone. Certain I was choosing the version that cost me the most, and him the least. I did not yet understand that a decision made entirely alone, however loving the reason behind it, is still a decision made without the other person's consent. I would learn that lesson properly only many years later in a ballroom 200 miles from that kitchen table, on my knees in broken glass. Garrett left an hour later with a folder full of the paperwork we'd need for Monday's meeting. And in his rush to gather everything off the table, he left a book behind. A slim paperback he'd been reading on the drive over. Its spine already cracked from use, something about negotiation. Reading people. The small tells that separate a genuine offer from a rehearsed one. "Keep it," he said, laughing already halfway out the door. "I basically had it memorized before I came here. Had to figure out how to convince you." I set it on the kitchen counter and didn't think about it again for years. It was just a book my son had left behind, the kind of thing you mean to return and never quite do until one evening far in the future when I would pull it back off a shelf without entirely knowing why. I want you to remember it anyway. Because 8 years later, sitting at that same counter, with a phone pressed to my ear, and my daughter-in-law's voice coming through it far too smooth for the words she was saying, that book would be the only reason I understood before anyone else in this story did exactly what I was listening to. I own 51% of my son's company, and he has never known it for a single day of the 16 years since. The papers that made that true were signed on a Tuesday morning in Harlan Voss's office, 3 weeks after Garrett left my kitchen with a folder of paperwork and a book he forgot to take with him. I sat across a conference table from a man I trusted completely, and together we built something designed from its very first clause to never be discovered by the one person it was built to protect. "You want to protect him," Harlan said, sliding the draft trust agreement across the table. "But you also want to protect yourself." "From what exactly?" "From a version of this where it goes wrong," I said. "And nobody has any recourse." That's the same thing Harlan said. Maybe it was. I've turned that sentence over more times than I can count in the years since, and I still haven't landed anywhere firm. The structure Harlan built was elegant in the way good engineering is always elegant. Nothing extra, nothing decorative. Every piece load-bearing. Capital would flow into Garrett's company through the August Kessler Family Trust, layered through holding entities designed by a man who understood that the difference between protected and unprotected often comes down to a single clause buried 3 paragraphs deep. My controlling interest, 51% documented, secured invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look, would sit at the trust level. Garrett would receive full operational authority. He would make every decision. He would build every relationship, close every deal, hire every employee. All of it would be entirely, genuinely his. I would simply own the ground he was building on. "He's going to find out eventually," Harlan said once the documents were drafted and waiting only for my signature. "These things always surface. Divorce, death, an audit, a nosy business partner, something. Then let it surface when it needs to," I said. "Not before. And if it surfaces the wrong way, at the wrong time, in front of the wrong people?" I hadn't thought that far ahead, not really. Not in any way I could have put into words that morning. "Then I'll deal with that when it happens," I said. "A man can't build a house waiting for the earthquake that might never come." Harlan didn't argue the point further, though I could tell from the set of his jaw that he wasn't entirely satisfied with my answer. He'd spent enough years watching families come apart over money to know that silence, however well-intentioned, has a way of curdling into something nobody meant for it to become. I understood that too, somewhere underneath the certainty I was carrying that morning. I just didn't yet understand it the way I would understand it later. I signed everything anyway. And then, because building a company from nothing requires more than money, it requires doors that stay closed to a 30-year-old developer with 3 years of track record, I made one more call before I left Harlan's office. Desmond Yates had spent 20 years in Oregon's Department of Agriculture and another decade turning the relationships he'd built there into a second career as a private investor with deep pockets and deeper connections. We'd known each other since the late 90s when I'd supplied pollination contracts for a state agricultural pilot program his office had overseen. We weren't close friends. Our lives didn't overlap enough for that, but we trusted each other, and in my experience, that has always proven considerably more durable than friendship. "I'm calling about my son," I told him. "I think it's worth your time to look at what he's building." "Tell me about him," Desmond said. I told him the truth. Not the polished version, not the version Garrett would have chosen for himself, but the real one. A young man who'd lost his job and built something from the wreckage anyway, who made smart decisions under pressure, who had the capacity to build something much larger if the right doors opened at the right time. Desmond met with Garrett the following month. By spring, he'd committed to a partnership that would carry Cascade Bloom through its first real growth. He never told Garrett about my call. I never told Garrett either, because what my son needed, what I understood even then, perhaps especially then, was to believe he had earned every inch of it himself. He had. That part was never a lie. The phone call I made didn't build his company. His own hands did that. I just made sure a door was open when he finally reached it. I want to tell you why I did all of this in the dark instead of standing beside him in the light, where a father is supposed to stand. The truth reaches back further than the trust. Further than Roy, further than the hives I lost at 34. It reaches back to a hospital room 8 years after that Tuesday morning, in Harlan's office, where my wife Dottie lay with a tube in her arm and a voice that had gone thin and papery in a way that still catches in my chest when I let myself think about it too directly. Garrett had stepped out to get coffee. It was just the two of us, the machines keeping their quiet rhythm, the window gray with late Oregon light. "August," she said. She only ever used my full name when something mattered enough to earn it. "Watch over him." I took her hand in both of mine. "Always," I told her. "You know I will." The room held its sound for a long moment. The soft tick of the monitor. The hallway noise thinned almost to nothing behind the door. My own breath catching somewhere I couldn't locate. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I just held her hand and let the silence do what neither of us had words left for. She passed 3 months later on a Tuesday morning, with the light coming the same pale gray through a different window, and my hand still in hers. I have thought about that promise every day for the years since, and I have kept it the only way I ever learned how to keep anything quietly, structurally, without announcement. I built a trust instead of writing a letter. I made a phone call instead of a toast at his wedding. I stood at the back of every room where his achievements were being celebrated, close enough to watch, far enough that no one ever thought to ask what my presence there actually meant. I protected my son by disappearing from every room where credit might have been given. Because I convinced myself, the way men my age convince ourselves of most things, that love and invisibility could be the same act if you were careful enough about the engineering. There is a version of the last 16 years where I told him everything the week Dottie died, sat him down at her kitchen table and explained exactly what I'd built and why, and let him carry the truth of it forward with his own eyes open. I have imagined that version more times than I'll admit. I always talked myself out of it for the same reason. Because I believed, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has already lost everything once, to someone he trusted, that the surest way to keep my son safe was to make sure no single piece of paper, no single conversation, ever gave anyone a reason to come after what I'd built for him. I kept that promise the only way I knew how, by disappearing from the light. I did not yet understand what that kind of promise would cost either of us. I would learn it in full 16 years later on a ballroom floor 200 miles from that hospital room, with my son's voice ringing through a microphone, and my granddaughter making a sound in the crowd that I would carry for the rest of my life. Priya said the word family 3 times in under 2 minutes, and I counted every one of them before she'd finished her second sentence. The call came on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks before the launch, while I was sitting in my kitchen with the television off and a cup of coffee going cold on the counter beside me. The way most of my evenings had gone since Dottie passed, existing quietly in a house built for two. My phone lit up with a name I rarely saw. We spoke maybe 4 times a year, and most of those were holidays, where the call lasted under 6 minutes. August. Her voice came through warm, practiced, the particular warmth of someone who has rehearsed a tone in advance and is pleased with how it's landed. "I'm so glad I caught you." "Everything all right?" I asked. "Everything's wonderful. I'm calling about something exciting, actually. Garrett's Series B launch is coming up in a few weeks at a hotel in Portland. It's going to be a beautiful evening, investors, the whole team, and we really want you there. As family." That was one. "Of course we want you there," she went on before I could answer. "It was actually Garrett's idea. He said it wouldn't feel like a real celebration without family in the room." 2. "I know how much these milestone nights mean to him," she said. "Having family present, especially now, it just matters." 3. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the counter. I knew Priya well enough to recognize the difference between a sentence someone believes and a sentence someone has built. This was the second kind, assembled cleanly, delivered smoothly, but carrying the faint mechanical quality of something rehearsed until the rough edges had worn away. There is a technique I remembered reading once years ago in a book my son had left behind on my kitchen counter and never come back for. A technique negotiators use when they want you to trust them faster than trust is naturally earned. You repeat a word tied to belonging, family, team, home. Not once, which reads as sincere, not 5 times, which reads as desperate, 3 times spaced carefully, is the number that lands somewhere underneath a listener's guard without them ever noticing they've been handled. I had read that chapter half asleep on a Sunday afternoon a long time ago, more out of boredom than intention, and I hadn't thought about it since. I thought about it now, standing in my kitchen with my daughter-in-law's voice still warm in my ear and something cold moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "That's thoughtful of him," I said, keeping my own voice easy. "What time should I be there?" She gave me the details. 7 o'clock, black tie optional, valet parking available. She mentioned the hotel's reputation, the caliber of the investors who'd be in the room, how important the evening was for the company's future. She said it would mean so much to Garrett. She said some version of that sentence 3 more times before we hung up, which I noticed and did not mention. "I'll be there," I told her. "Wonderful." The warmth in her voice climbed another degree, the particular lift of a performer's smile widening at the sound of applause reaching her from somewhere off stage. "It really will be a special night, August." She hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat with the dead phone in my hand for a long moment, listening to the house around me. The refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. Wind pressing against a window somewhere upstairs. The particular silence of a place that has been lived in long enough to hold a person's thoughts without needing to comment on them. Then I called my son. He answered on the 4th ring, traffic noise behind him, the compressed busyness of a man in the middle of something that mattered more to him than his phone. "Hey, Dad." "Priya just called," I said. "About the launch." A pause. Brief, almost nothing. "Right, yeah. You should come. Was it your idea to invite me to—" Another pause, half a second longer than the first. My chest tightened, waiting for the answer, because some part of me had already guessed what the truth would sound like, coming from him, and some part of me already knew this wasn't going to be it. "Sure," he said. "Of course it was. It'll be good to have you there." "Sure, of course." The words of a man confirming a dentist appointment, not inviting his father to the biggest professional night of his year. "I'll drive up," I said. "Don't worry about arranging anything for me." "Okay, listen, Dad, Can we talk later this week?" "Go ahead," I said. "I'll see you on the 19th. He hung up first. I stood in that kitchen a long while after holding a phone that had gone quiet in my hand, thinking about 3 repeated words and a pause that lasted half a second too long. I want to be honest about what I knew and didn't know that night, because it would be easy telling this now to make myself sound more certain in that kitchen than I actually was. I didn't know yet what I was walking into. I knew only that something in the shape of the invitation didn't match the sound of it the way a beam can look sound to the eye and still ring wrong when you tap at some fracture running through it that hasn't announced itself yet, but is already there, already waiting for the right amount of weight to find it. I thought about calling Wren that night too, asking her directly whether anything was wrong at home, whether the warmth in her mother's voice matched what she was seeing at the dinner table. I decided against it. She was 11. Whatever she might have told me, I had no business asking a child to carry the weight of confirming her own parents' trouble. Not before I had anything solid enough of my own to act on. I would wait. I had spent my whole life waiting for the right moment to act instead of the easiest one. And I saw no reason to abandon that discipline now 3 weeks out from a party I still couldn't explain my own dread about. I got the old book down from the shelf that night for the first time in 8 years. Sat at the kitchen table and read the chapter on trust-building language twice through. Slowly, the way you reread a blueprint when you've started to suspect the numbers don't add up. The chapter had a name for what Priya had done on the phone. It called it anchoring 3 repetitions evenly spaced, designed to install a feeling of belonging before the listener has any reason to have earned it. Somewhere in the margin, in handwriting that wasn't mine, Garrett had written a single word: works. I still didn't have a name for what I was afraid of. I just knew closing that book near midnight that I wasn't going to walk into that ballroom without understanding what kind of trap I might be stepping toward. 10 days before the launch, my son sat alone in his office at midnight, staring at a number that didn't match anything it was supposed to match. And he told absolutely no one, not his lawyer, not his board, not the father he'd soon accuse of not belonging at his own company's party. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I want to be clear about that because the story I'm telling you now moves back and forth in time more than I'd like, and I don't want you thinking I had some window into my son's private hours that I didn't actually have. I learned what follows only later, in pieces. Most of it from Garrett himself, sitting on a bench outside a hotel lobby with his tie loosened and his composure finally completely gone. But it belongs here in the order it actually happened, because you need to understand something before we go any further. My son was not simply a man standing beside a woman doing something terrible. He was already quietly on his own starting to suspect her. It began with a line item. Cascade Bloom's Series B deck required 3 years of audited financials, and Garrett had asked his CFO, his wife, for the final consolidated numbers, so he could review them one more time before they went to print. Priya had always handled that side of the business. She was good at it, better than he was. And for years he'd been grateful not to have to think too hard about spreadsheets when he had orchards and pollination contracts and investor relationships to manage instead. That night, running through the numbers, out of habit more than suspicion, he found a category labeled Agricultural Development Partners that didn't match anything he remembered approving. $40,000 here, $60,000 there, spread across 11 months, always in amounts small enough to avoid the threshold that would have required board sign-off, always tagged to a vendor name he didn't recognize. He told himself it was probably nothing. A subcontractor, a pilot program he'd forgotten about, buried somewhere in 100 emails he'd skimmed too fast to remember. He closed the laptop that night and told himself he'd ask Priya about it in the morning, the easy way, over coffee, the way you ask your wife about anything that probably has a simple explanation. He didn't ask her the next morning. Some part of him, the part he would later admit to me, was already afraid of the answer, decided to look a little further first. 3 days before the launch, he found the rest of it. The vendor Agricultural Development Partners LLC wasn't a vendor at all. It was a shell registered 18 months earlier in Delaware, with a single listed officer whose name meant nothing to Garrett until he cross-referenced it against a filing from an entirely different company, one registered in Oregon under the name Whitmore Strategic Holdings, Priya's maiden name. A holding company Garrett had never heard of, never approved, and had certainly never been told existed. He spent that third night doing what he did best, building a model, tracing the numbers the way he'd trace any other financial problem, treating it like due diligence on a stranger's company, instead of an investigation into his own marriage. It was easier that way. Spreadsheets don't flinch. Spreadsheets don't ask you how you're sleeping, or notice that you've stopped meeting their eyes at dinner. He built out 3 separate timelines, cross-checked 11 wire transfers against board meeting minutes, and confirmed with the same discipline he'd have brought to any hostile audit that every dollar led back to the same place. The money hadn't gone to agricultural development. It had gone in a circle out of Cascade Bloom, through the shell and back into an account that traced 3 steps removed to his own wife. He sat with that knowledge for a long time that night, alone in an office lit by nothing but his laptop screen. And here is the part I understood only much later. The part that broke something in me when he finally said it out loud. On that bench outside the Marchmont. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call his board. He didn't call his father, the one man who might have known exactly how to move a piece of information like that into the light without it destroying everything around it. He sat there and thought instead about what it would mean if he was right. If Priya had been quietly redirecting company funds for 18 months, it meant the wife he'd built a company and a marriage and a decade of his life around had been lying to him with a precision that required real discipline, real patience, real intention. It meant every quiet dinner where she'd asked about his day, every late night she'd stayed up handling the numbers so he wouldn't have to. Every moment he'd believed they were building something together. All of it had been happening alongside something else entirely, something he had never once been allowed to see. And underneath that fear, quieter, harder to look at directly, sat another one. If she had been managing him this whole time, steering conversations, controlling what he saw and when he saw it, how much of the company he thought he'd built with his own hands had actually been built the way she wanted it built, for reasons that had nothing to do with him at all? He had spent years being told by magazines and investors and his own reflection in the mirror that he was a self-made man. Standing in that office at midnight, he wondered for the first time whether he had ever been anything more than a very convincing face for someone else's plan. He closed the laptop. He didn't sleep. And in the morning, he did the one thing that would define the next 10 days of his life more than any spreadsheet ever could. He said nothing. Not because he didn't believe what he'd found. Because he did believe it, completely, and believing it terrified him more than any lie ever could have. He told himself he needed more proof before he accused anyone of anything. He told himself the launch was 10 days away, and blowing up his marriage publicly right before the biggest funding round of his career would destroy the company along with everything else. He told himself a dozen careful, reasonable things, and every one of them was in its own way true. But underneath all of it, if he was honest, and it would take him a long time, and a ballroom full of strangers to get there. My son was afraid of one thing more than any of it. He didn't yet know whether the first person to betray him in his own house had been his wife, or whether it had been his own silence, the moment he chose to look away from what he'd already found, rather than say the words out loud. By the time I saw the Marchmont's glass tower rising over the Portland skyline, I had already made peace with something I couldn't yet name, and that peace turned out to be the most dangerous thing I carried into that ballroom. The drive from Hood River takes just over an hour if the traffic on 84 cooperates, which it rarely does on a Friday evening. I left with plenty of time to spare because I wanted the hour, not because I needed it. Some men think better sitting still. I have never been one of them. I think best with my hands on a wheel in the road doing the work of emptying my mind out enough for something useful to fill it back in. The orchards were in full bloom the whole way down the valley, white and pale pink stretching in even rows toward the base of the hills. The kind of sight that still catches me even after 70-some springs of watching it happen. Dottie used to say April was the only month that forgave the rest of the year for existing. She'd drag me out to the porch every evening that first week, of blossom coffee in one hand, her other hand resting on my forearm, like she was afraid the flowers might disappear if she didn't have a witness. I used to tease her about it. I would give a great deal now to be teased for standing on that porch one more time. I thought about her a lot on that drive, more than I usually let myself. Not the sickness at the end, not the hospital light. The porch. The way she used to walk the rows, counting hive boxes out loud just to hear the numbers, though she already knew every count by heart. The particular quiet satisfaction on her face when a queen she'd helped me raise took to a new colony without a fight. She had an instinct for which pairings would hold and which wouldn't, better than mine, though she'd never once put it in those words. She just knew things about how living systems settled into each other, the same way she'd known things about people. She would have known about Priya. I thought that clearly somewhere past the town of Troutdale, traffic finally starting to thicken toward the city. She would have taken one look at that woman across our kitchen table the first Thanksgiving Garrett brought her home, and known something the rest of us took years to even suspect. I don't say that to make myself feel foolish for missing it. I say it because it's true, and because some part of me has always believed that losing her meant losing the one instrument in the house sensitive enough to catch things like that before they calcified into damage. I remembered driving the exact words she'd used that first Thanksgiving, years before any of this. Not a warning, nothing so direct. Just a small observation tossed off while she dried a serving dish at the sink. She talks like she's already decided what everyone in the room is going to say back to her. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. People talk that way in business, I'd told her, and she'd let it go without pushing. The way she let most things go that weren't hers to fight. I wondered now, easing into the airport traffic, how many other small observations like that one she'd made and never repeated, trusting that I'd notice on my own eventually, the way she'd always trusted me with everything else. I thought too about the folder sitting in Harlan's safe and the one sitting in my own bottom desk drawer at home. Copies of the same documents filed different places, the way a careful man keeps backups of anything that actually matters. I hadn't looked at the home copy in months. I found myself somewhere around the airport exit, running through its contents from memory anyway, the way you check a structure's numbers one more time before you trust your weight to it, even when you already know the math holds. 51%. 16 years. A son who had built something real with his own two hands, standing on ground I had quietly purchased and never once mentioned owning. I want to tell you I felt certain driving into that city that everything was about to come apart. I didn't. What I felt was smaller and stranger than certainty, a kind of settled readiness. The particular calm that comes from having already decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that whatever happened tonight, I would not be walking into it unarmed. I had the folder's contents in my head. I had Harlan on standby, though neither of us had said as much out loud. I had 40 years of learning, the hard way. Exactly what it costs to trust something you haven't bothered to protect. I turned the radio on somewhere past the last orchard rows, more out of habit than any real desire to listen, and let it run through a country station for a while, before settling on nothing in particular. The comfortable static that happens when you're between towns and between thoughts. A song came on that Dottie used to hum in the kitchen, something slow from decades back, and I let it play through without changing the dial, though I couldn't have told you afterward a single lyric of it. Some songs aren't for listening to. They're for having in the room with you. What I didn't have, and wouldn't understand until much later, was any sense of how close the danger actually was, or how many different directions it was coming from at once. I thought I was walking into one kind of evening, an uncomfortable one, maybe a few too many questions about who I was and why I'd been invited, the usual quiet condescension I'd learned to absorb without much cost. I had no idea I was walking into two separate betrayals unfolding on two separate timelines, converging on the same room at the same hour. Neither one of them anything I could have prepared for, no matter how many folders I'd memorized. The city opened up around me the way it always does from that stretch of highway. Glass towers catching the last orange light of evening, the river running silver underneath the bridges, everything polished and vertical and entirely unbothered by whatever was about to happen inside one particular ballroom on one particular floor of one particular hotel. I found a parking garage 2 blocks from the Marchmont, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to it tick as it cooled. Then I got out, straightened my jacket, and walked the 2 blocks toward the warm amber light spilling out from under the hotel's entrance awning. into an evening I still believed right up until the moment it happened, that I understood. 3. I remembered the number even as her heel had already begun to move. Priya found me in the lobby before I'd made it 20 feet past the doors, her hand closing around my arm with the particular warmth of someone greeting a camera rather than a person. "August, we're so glad you made it all the way from Hood River." She said it loudly enough to carry to the coat check attendant and the couple waiting by the elevator, as though I'd crossed a mountain range on foot instead of driven an hour on a state highway. "Wouldn't have missed it," I said. "Come on." She tucked her hand around my arm, not the way a daughter-in-law walks a family member into a room, but the way a handler moves a piece of equipment into position for a photograph. "Everyone's already inside. Garrett will be so glad you're here." She steered me toward the ballroom entrance, and I noted with the professional attention of a man who had spent 35 years reading the intentional geometry of built spaces that she chose the route through the widest section of the lobby, past the most people, through the main doors instead of the side entrance that would have been faster, quieter, and considerably less visible. I noted it. I filed it. I kept walking. The ballroom was enormous, gold-lit, loud, with the particular calibrated volume of people trying to sound relaxed while simultaneously trying to be noticed. 60 investors in dark suits clustered near the bar. On a raised platform at the far end, beneath a screen the size of a highway billboard, sat a glass display case, 12 queen colonies built for tonight's photographs. The closest thing Cascade Bloom had to a physical symbol of everything the company claimed to have built. I found Wren almost immediately. She had a way of being easy for me to locate in any room, something in how she held herself that my eyes recognized before my brain caught up. She was at a table near the wall, and the moment she saw me, her whole face lit with the unguarded relief children still have before they learn to hide it for an audience. She started to stand. Priya's hand tightened on my arm, just slightly. A pressure adjustment small enough to look accidental, and angled us both toward the stage instead. "Garrett wants to introduce you to a few people before the remarks start," she said brightly. "Big night for him." I looked back at Wren. She'd settled into her chair watching us with eyes that missed considerably less than most adults gave her credit for. Her mouth formed 2 words silently across the noise of the room. "I'm sorry." "Priya," I said. "I'd like to say hello to my granddaughter first." Of course. In just a moment." She patted my arm and kept walking, and I let her, not because I couldn't resist, but because I was watching the route she was choosing. The angle of approach toward the stage. The fact that she'd positioned us to walk directly along the left side, where the display case sat at the far end under the lights. Along the way, she introduced me to 2 men I never got the names of, both investors, both offering the kind of handshake that assesses more than it greets. She kept up a running narration the entire time, the guest list, the evening's agenda, something about a keynote Garrett had rehearsed for weeks, and I was listening to approximately none of it, because I was watching where her feet were going instead. We reached the edge of the platform. The case was 3 feet to my right, glass catching the overhead chandeliers, 12 colonies humming faintly behind it, entirely unaware of what they'd been built into. Priya half turned toward me as if to say something else, and her left foot moved outward. Not backward, not sideways, but forward. And out at precisely the angle that would intersect with my next step. And then the floor disappeared. I don't remember the sound of the glass so much as I remember the temperature cold, sudden wrong, against my palms as I went down through it. The display case tilting under my shoulder, and coming apart around me in a way that reinforced glass isn't supposed to come apart. Not cleanly, in long fractured sheets instead of a shatter. Bees came pouring out, disoriented, into the light. My knee found the platform's edge on the way down, and registered its complaint in language that needed no translation. I lay there a moment, glass biting through fabric. And somewhere above and behind me I heard my son's voice find the microphone. "Everyone, please, this is not part of the program." A pause I felt more than heard. "This man doesn't belong at my company's launch." For a moment after the words landed, nothing in that ballroom moved at all. No footsteps toward me, no gasp resolving into motion. Just the low mechanical hum of the ventilation system, and somewhere beneath it, glass settling, and a single bee circling once near my ear before drifting off toward the light fixtures. Confused rather than angry, exactly the way I'd have expected. I did not look up right away. I let my hands rest flat against the cold floor, feeling the last of the glass shift under my palms, and I listened instead to the silence holding to a chair creaking somewhere as someone leaned forward to see better rather than to help, to my own heartbeat working steady and hard beneath a stillness that had nothing steady about it at all. A young man broke from the catering line before anyone else moved, dropping to a crouch beside me and clearing glass from around my hands with his bare fingers, saying nothing at all while he worked. His name tag read Teo. He didn't ask if I was hurt or make any show of the moment for the room watching. He simply worked methodically, quiet, the way a person does a job they've decided matters, regardless of whether anyone thanks them for it. "Thank you," I said when he'd cleared enough glass for me to move my hands freely. He nodded once, the way people nod when they've done what they came to do, and helped me get my good knee under me before he moved off toward the kitchen doors without another word. I looked up and found my son's face above the podium, already rebuilding itself into something composed, already deciding. I understood even then how this would be explained tomorrow. Nobody else in that room had moved toward. Not one of the 60 investors holding their glasses, not my son, not until that moment anyone at all. "It's time." I said those two words into a cracked phone screen in a service hallway that smelled like industrial dish soap, and Harlan Voss, who had never once hurried in the 22 years I'd known him, answered with a single word that carried more weight than most men manage in a full sentence. "Confirmed." I'd found a spot against the hallway wall, out of the traffic of kitchen staff moving through their Friday evening, with the efficient rhythm of people who don't have time to pretend about anything. My knee was announcing itself in terms impossible to ignore. Glass was still caught somewhere in the weave of my trousers. I pulled the phone from my jacket pocket, cracked screen catching the fluorescent light overhead, and called the one number I kept for situations that genuinely required it. Harlan answered on the second ring. "Gus, she did it," I said. "In front of the full room. Cameras were running." A pause on the line, not shock. Harlan didn't shock easily, but the particular quiet of a man cross-referencing new information against everything he already suspected. "Are you hurt?" "Knee's angry, nothing structural." "Good." Another pause. "Are you certain about what you saw?" "I'm a man who spent 35 years reading how things fall," I said. "That foot did not move by accident." "All right." I heard something shift in his voice, not louder, just more deliberate, the sound of a gear engaging. "I'll need 45 minutes to make the necessary calls. Simone's already aware. In general terms, I told her there was a reasonable chance tonight would require board intervention. We both hoped I was wrong. That stopped me for a moment. Simone Achterberg, independent chair of Cascade Bloom's board, a woman I'd met exactly twice and spoken with maybe half a dozen times by phone, had apparently been sitting somewhere in this city all evening, warned in advance that I might need her. "Tell her I said thank you," I managed. "Tell her yourself in 45 minutes, Harlan said, and hung up with the efficiency of a man who had a significant number of calls left to make. I lowered the phone and found a plastic folding chair against the wall, the kind that exists in the back of every hotel and restaurant kitchen in the country, functional and entirely without pretense. I sat down in my ruined jacket and waited, listening to the kitchen noise moving around me, a sheet pan clattering somewhere deeper in the jazz band on the other side of the wall, starting something slow and wandering that I could feel more than hear through my sternum. I was still sitting there when the service door pushed open and a small figure slipped through sideways. One shoulder leading the way, the particular careful entrance of a kid who isn't entirely sure she's allowed to be somewhere. Grandpa. Wren crossed the hallway in 4 quick steps and wrapped both arms around my midsection before I'd fully registered she was there. I put my arms around her and held on, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because some reunions don't need an opening line. "How'd you get back here?" I asked, into the top of her head. She pulled back just far enough to look up at me, her eyes going straight to the frosted glass damage still crusted along my sleeve. "I told the waiter by the side door I felt sick and needed air," she said, which wasn't entirely a lie. A beat. "Are you okay? Does your knee hurt? I saw you go down." "Been through worse," I said. "Sit with me a minute." She pulled her chair close enough that our shoulders touched, folded her hands in her lap with a formality that looked borrowed from adults she'd been watching closely. "Grandpa," she said. "It wasn't an accident." My chest tightened. "Tell me what you know. All of it." She took a breath and told me, evenly, carefully, the way she always spoke when she understood the details mattered. 2 weeks earlier, home early from school for a half day, she'd gone upstairs for her tablet and heard her mother on the phone in the study, the door not quite closed. She hadn't meant to listen, but her mother's voice had sounded wrong, tight, in a way that made Ren stop in the hallway instead of walking past. She said, "He needs to look incompetent, unstable. One bad night in public is all we need." Ren's brow furrowed, pulling the words up carefully. And then she said the documentation practically writes itself. The words landed in my stomach like cold water. "Did she say who she was talking to?" Ren shook her head. "I didn't hear a name, but after she hung up, she was on her laptop for a long time, and she had this look, like when she wins something." I knew that look. I'd seen it exactly once before, years ago, across a dinner table. "Why didn't you tell me this when you called yesterday morning?" I asked. Her eyes went wet at the corners, not spilling, just sheening. "I tried. I said, be careful, but I didn't know how to say the rest without—" Her voice wobbled. She pressed her lips together, steadying herself. "I didn't want to scare you, and I thought maybe if I hoped hard enough, it wouldn't happen anyway." 11 years old. And she'd been carrying that alone for 2 weeks, hoping a child's wish might be enough to stop something already in motion. I took both her hands in mine. They were cold. "You did exactly right," I told her, "both times, this morning and tonight." "Is it bad, Grandpa? What's going to happen?" "Some things are going to change," I said honestly. "But the people who love each other, that part doesn't change. That's not up for negotiation. Understand me?" She nodded a small, emphatic dip of her head and leaned her head against my shoulder for a moment, before straightening up and squaring her small shoulders. "Okay," she said. "What do I do?" "Go back to your table," I told her. "Act normal. Don't let your mother know you came back here." She studied me a second longer, something settling behind her eyes that looked less like a child's trust and more like a decision made after weighing the evidence. "Okay," she said. "But Grandpa—" "Yeah. Don't let them win." She slipped back through the service door before I could answer, and it swung shut behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo longer than it should have. I checked my watch. 45 minutes from Harlan's call. 32 of them remained. I sat back down in the plastic chair, the folder's contents fixed in memory, and my granddaughter's 4 words settling into my chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Don't let them win. 31 years of law hadn't taught Harlan to put it that cleanly. It had taken an 11-year-old about 4 seconds. My son found me in that hallway to ask me for one thing, and instead he told me something that changed the shape of everything between us before either of us had finished speaking. I heard him before I saw him. That particular clearing of his throat, low and deliberate, the sound he'd been making since he was 15 and needed a moment to compose himself before saying something difficult. Some habits survive everything: success, distance, even years of telling yourself the person you used to be is someone to be ashamed of. The door opened and Garrett stepped in. He'd loosened his tie, just the top button undone, and his jacket sat wrong on his shoulders the way expensive suits do when the man wearing them is carrying tension in places the tailor never accounted for. He looked both ways down the hallway with the darting eyes of someone who'd asked a staff member where his father went and hadn't liked the answer. He found me in the plastic chair. Something moved across his face, relief, irritation, guilt, calculation, cycling fast enough I couldn't have said which one won. "Dad, what are you still doing back here?" "Waiting," I said. He stopped a few feet away, hands going into his trouser pockets, a gesture I recognized as his version of steadying himself. "Waiting for what?" "For the next part of the evening." His jaw worked. "Look, what happened out there, it wasn't supposed to go like that." "Which part?" He pulled one hand from his pocket, pressed it through his hair. "The case, the fall, the whole scene. That wasn't the plan." "What was the plan, Garrett?" He didn't seem to notice the slip. He shifted his weight, and I watched him do the calculation behind his eyes, how much to admit, how much to manage, where the line sat between honesty and exposure. He'd always been good at that math. He'd gotten considerably better at it over the years. "The plan was for tonight to go smoothly," he said carefully. "Investors' good impressions. You know how important this kind of event is." "I do," I said. "I helped make it possible for this kind of event to exist, so yes, I understand the importance." His face tightened. "That's not fair." "I'm not trying to be unfair. I'm trying to have an honest conversation. Those aren't the same thing." He crossed his arms. A different gesture now, defensive. The posture of a man who decided the best offense was a fortified position. "I need you to come back inside, Dad. People are asking questions. It looks bad." My chest squeezed with a quick, precise pain. Not anger. The precision of the phrase itself. "It looks bad." Not, "I'm worried about you." Not, "I'm sorry for what I said." "What kind of questions?" I asked. "About you." His voice dropped further. "About who you are, why you were here. Some of the investors they haven't met you before, and after what happened—" "After what you said," I said quietly. He stopped. The words sat between us in the industrial air of that hallway, and he had enough decency left not to argue the point directly. "After the situation," he said instead, which was a retreat dressed as a revision. "It created an impression I need to manage. If you come back in, have a drink, talk to a few people, it smooths things over." He looked at me, trying for reasonable, landing closer to pleading. "That's all I'm asking, Dad. An hour. Then you can go home." Then you can go home. The sentence of a man who had decided his father's presence was a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be tended. "Do you know why I came tonight?" I asked. He blinked. "Because Priya..." "Not because of Priya." I kept my voice level. "I came because you're my son. Because you're carrying something you haven't told anyone, and some part of me has known that for weeks without having the words for it." His arms uncrossed slowly. Something moved across his face, not composure breaking composure already gone, replaced by something rawer underneath it. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I found something," he said finally. 10 days ago, in the financials." The hallway went very quiet around those words. "What kind of something?" "Money going out through a vendor that doesn't exist. Coming back through a company registered under Priya's maiden name." His voice had dropped almost to nothing. The words coming faster now that the first one had broken loose. "I've spent 10 days confirming it instead of saying anything. I told myself I needed more proof. I told myself the timing was wrong." He pressed the heel of his hand against one eye, hard, briefly. "I think I told myself a lot of things so I wouldn't have to say the real one out loud. Which is that I've spent a decade building something I'm not sure was ever entirely mine to build." His jaw worked the same muscle jumping near his ear that used to jump when he was a boy fighting not to cry over something too big for him to name. I don't know if I'm angrier at her for what she did, or at myself for knowing and doing nothing. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Somewhere beyond the wall, the jazz band shifted into something slower, and the kitchen noise moved around us the way it had all evening, indifferent to whatever was breaking open 6 feet from the stock pots. I didn't reach for him. I didn't trust my hands yet not to shake if I did. I let the silence hold instead. Let it do the work neither of us had language ready for. watching my son's shoulders rise and fall once unsteady, the particular unsteadiness of a man setting something down he'd been carrying. Wrong, for a very long time. My phone rang, breaking whatever the hallway had been holding. Harlan's name lit up the cracked screen. I answered. "They're here, Gus," he said. "Lobby, 2 minutes." I looked at my son, who had come to that hallway to ask me to disappear quietly for an hour, and instead had told me the one true thing either of us had said all night. I stood up from the plastic chair, my knee registering its complaint one more time, and smoothed the front of my ruined jacket with both hands. "Stay close," I told him. "Whatever happens next, you're going to want to be standing where you can see all of it." He didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded once and followed me toward the ballroom doors. The room changed before anyone said a word. I felt it the second the ballroom doors opened. There's a moment in every large gathering when enough people notice something is wrong that the whole atmosphere adjusts at once, the way air pressure shifts before a storm rolls in off the gorge. I felt it the instant Harlan pushed those doors open and the three of them walked through together. It started at the edges. A junior associate near the entrance glanced up and clocked something in Simone Achterberg's face and went very still. The woman beside him noticed his reaction and turned to look herself. The stillness spread not quickly, not dramatically, but with the particular inevitability of a room trained to read the entrance of anyone who might matter to their professional futures. Harlan Voss walked in first, the same unhurried pace I'd watched him carry into rooms for 22 years. A man who had already read the ending and found it satisfactory. 72 years old, silver hair combed back with something close to military precision, a charcoal suit that had cost real money, and wore it without announcing the fact. He carried a leather briefcase in his left hand, the same dark brown case he'd owned since I first met him, refurbished twice because Harlan believed quality things deserved maintenance rather than replacement. He had never once in all those years walked into a room without already knowing exactly how he intended to leave it. Behind him, a step to his right, walked Simone Achterberg. I'd met her exactly twice in person, both times brief and professional, conducted in conference rooms with other people present. What I remembered from those meetings was this. She was the kind of woman who made other people aware of their own posture without doing anything in particular to cause it. 55 years old, dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, a black suit tailored to within a millimeter of intention, no jewelry beyond small pearl earrings. She moved with the specific economy of someone who had learned long ago that every unnecessary gesture diluted presence rather than adding to it. Desmond Yates came last, 64 years old. The kind of man whose 2 decades in state government and one more building a private investment career had left him with a network running deep enough that half the room owed some portion of their professional existence to a door he'd either opened or declined to close. He wasn't tall. He didn't need to be. He had the particular quality of filling whatever space he occupied. Entirely the same quality I remembered from 30 years earlier, when we'd first shaken hands over a very different kind of contract. The jazz band kept playing to their credit, though. Even they visibly lost a little confidence in the next 8 bars. "Stay close," Harlan said quietly, which was more direction than he typically offered anyone. Simone moved with us, but slightly ahead, the way a ship's prow moves through water, creating the space we needed to cross the room. Staff members stepped back as she passed. A senior manager near the bar actually set down his drink. I kept my eyes forward and my spine straight, aware of the 60 investors turning in sequence, aware of the enormous LED screen behind the stage, which had switched at some point from looping orchard footage to a static company logo. Someone had made a quiet decision about what to broadcast after the earlier incident. Desmond stopped in front of me before we'd made it a third of the way across the floor. I hadn't seen him in person for almost 2 years. He looked older. Everyone did. But his eyes were exactly the same dark observant, missing considerably less than most people assumed. He looked at my glass-torn jacket. Then he looked at my face. Then Desmond Yates, former state agriculture official, 30-year investor, the most connected man in that room by a margin that wasn't close, lowered his head in a slow, deliberate bow. Not the perfunctory nod of a business greeting, a real bow, conscious, intentional, the kind that requires a decision rather than a reflex. "August," he said, his voice carrying to every table within 15 feet without effort. "I owe this man more than most people here will ever understand." The jazz band played its last note and stopped. The room went quiet enough that I heard a champagne flute set down 3 tables away. Garrett stood beside me, and I felt, rather than saw, the way his body reacted, the small involuntary step backward, the sharp intake of breath, the complete structural failure of whatever composure he'd spent the last hour trying to rebuild. 60 investors watched the most powerful man in the room bow to the old man in the ruined suit. "You didn't owe me anything, Des," I said quietly. "You took a chance on my son. That's all I ever asked." "It was more than that," he said firmly, "and you know it." He straightened and turned to look at Garrett, his expression not unkind but entirely without accommodation. "You should know what kind of man your father is." Garrett's mouth opened. His eyes moved from Desmond to me to the briefcase in Harlan's hand. And I watched a question forming behind them that he wasn't ready to ask yet, because he wasn't ready for whatever answer was coming. He found his voice before I found mine. "Dad." His jaw was tight, his eyes cutting between the 3 of us with barely concealed alarm. "What is this? Who are these people?" "You know Harlan," I said. His eyes cut to my attorney. "Why is your lawyer here?" Simone stepped forward before I could answer, extending her hand with the smooth precision of someone who had executed this particular maneuver in many rooms before this one. "Good evening, Mr. Kessler. I'm Simone Ochterberg. I believe we've spoken by phone twice, most recently in September, regarding the Q3 board review." Garrett shook her hand reflexively, the way people shake hands while still processing whether they should. "Miss Ochterberg, I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "I drove down from Seattle this afternoon," she said pleasantly. "At Mr. Voss's request, in my capacity as independent board chair." A brief pause calibrated to land. "I hope that's not inconvenient." Garrett's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, alarm, the early edge of anger, and then the managed smoothness of a man trained to perform composure in high-stakes rooms. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said. "Tonight is a company social event, not a board matter." "I don't see why that distinction should matter, Garrett." Priya's voice cut across the room, unhurried, and carrying easily over 60 people pretending not to stare. She had crossed from wherever she'd been standing close enough now that I could see her jaw set like something poured and hardened, her fingers wrapped tight around the clutch bag in her hands. Harlan opened his briefcase and set it down on the nearest table without a word. "This is a family matter," Priya said, her voice sharp and controlled. The voice of a woman who had decided that offense was the only option she had left. "Whatever private arrangements exist between August and Garrett, they have no bearing on—" "Ms. Kessler?" Simone turned to look at her with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had encountered this particular argument before, many times, in many rooms. When controlling interest in a registered corporate entity is involved, it is by definition not a family matter. It is a governance matter, and governance is precisely my jurisdiction. Priya's jaw tightened. Her eyes cut to me fast and hot and assessing, and I held her gaze steadily and did not look away. "There's one more thing," Harlan said, reaching into the briefcase. He removed a single sheet of paper and glanced toward the production booth at the back of the ballroom, a glass-enclosed platform where 2 technicians had been managing the evening's audio and video. "Excuse me," Simone said, her voice pitched to carry without requiring volume. "I need the stage camera footage from this evening, beginning at approximately 7:40. Full playback on the main screen, please." The senior technician, a young woman with short red hair and the particular expression of someone who had just understood her Friday night was about to become considerably more complicated, looked toward Garrett. Garrett said nothing. His face hadn't recovered from whatever Harlan was about to tell him, and he didn't appear to have the resources available to mount an objection. "Yes, ma'am," the technician said and turned back to her board. I stood near the table's edge, watching my son instead of watching the room. I want to tell you something about that moment that I never said out loud to him, not that night, not since. There was a version of watching him stand there, jaw tight, eyes red-rimmed, carrying a secret of his own that none of these 60 investors had any idea existed, that felt almost unbearably like looking at a mirror 40 years too early. He was learning right there in front of everyone exactly what it costs to have trusted the wrong structure. I had learned the same lesson at 34, alone in a hospital bed. He was learning it standing up, in a room full of witnesses, which felt in some ways crueler and in other ways more merciful. And I couldn't tell you even now which of those was true. I didn't say any of that. I only stood there and let my face do whatever it was doing and hoped it looked steadier than I felt. These, Harlan said, addressing Garrett now with the careful neutrality of a man about to change the geometry of the room, are the founding capitalization records of Cascade Bloom Technologies, filed with the Oregon Secretary of State in March of 11 years ago. Garrett's eyes dropped to the papers. His jaw was tight, arms crossed, the posture of a man bracing to argue. I know my own founding records, he said. I filed them myself. You filed the operating agreement, Harlan said pleasantly. These are the trust documents that preceded it. Specifically the August Kessler Family Trust established 15 years ago, which provided the seed capital for your company's formation through a series of layered holding entities. He paused, letting that land. Your father invested $340,000 of his retirement savings. He did it through a trust structure that retained a controlling 51% interest at the trust level. You received full operational authority. He retained ultimate ownership control. The room had gone very quiet around us. The investors who'd been maintaining the polite fiction of not listening abandoned it entirely. I could feel 60 people holding their breath at once. Garrett's arms dropped from his chest. He stopped, started again. That's not possible. I would have known. The structure was designed so that you wouldn't, Harlan said. Not as deception, as protection. Your father's instructions were explicit. You were to have every opportunity to succeed or fail on your own operational decisions. The controlling interest existed as a safeguard, not a leash. Garrett turned to me, and the expression on his face was something I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. Raw, unguarded, stripped of every layer of executive polish he'd built over 15 years. His voice cracked at the edges. Dad. Is this true? My throat tightened. Every word. You've held controlling interest in my company for 16 years, he said. And you never told me? I told you I believed in you, I said. That was the part that mattered. Garrett pressed both hands flat against the table and leaned forward, and I could see the tremor running through his arms. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated and more painful than anger. I built this company, he said, his voice dropping to something raw and urgent. I made the decisions. I hired the people. I closed the deals. Yes, I said, you did. Every one of those things is true. Then what was the point of the point? Desmond's voice cut in from where he stood nearby, carrying that particular quality of a man used to filling a room without effort. Was that your father made it possible for someone to take a chance on you when you had 3 years of track record and a very good business plan? He paused. I'm that someone. Your father called me 11 years ago and told me his son was worth betting on. I trusted his judgment. Your company exists at its current scale because of that phone call. Garrett straightened slowly. His face had gone pale, not the angry pale of a man who felt cheated, but the stunned pale of someone whose entire self-narrative had just been quietly, irrevocably revised. You called Desmond, he said, looking at me. The Yates partnership. That was you. I opened a door, I said. You walked through it. Both things are true simultaneously. A man near the front of the crowd leaned forward in his chair. One of the senior investors, a man I'd later learn was named Marcus Lindquist, who'd been with Cascade Bloom for 4 years, and had never, in my observation across the room, shown anything other than polished confidence. His expression had moved decisively past polished into something more direct. Garrett, Marcus's voice carried the particular carefulness of a man choosing words in front of a room he suddenly wasn't sure he understood. Did you represent yourself to this board as having built this company independently, without undisclosed family investment structures? Garrett's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I didn't know, he said. I genuinely did not know about the trust. Marcus looked toward Simone. Her expression stayed professionally neutral in a way that communicated more than emotion could have managed. That will be a matter for the board review, she said, which I am formally initiating as of this evening. Nobody in the room moved to challenge her on it, and I understood, watching their faces, that nobody intended to. The screen above the stage flickered, went dark for 3 seconds, then filled with a timestamp, 7:41 p.m. The ballroom before the fall, seen from the camera position at stage left, the display case centered in frame, the podium to the right, the main floor spreading out beyond it. The room's ambient noise died completely. 60 people turned toward the screen with the focused collective attention of an audience that understands something important is about to happen. I watched from where I stood near the table, and I didn't need to watch the screen myself. I'd been there. I knew what the footage contained. Instead, I watched faces. I watched Desmond's expression settle into the grave, still quality of a man confirming what he'd suspected. I watched Marcus lean slowly back in his chair, arms crossing, the body language of someone revising a significant assumption. I watched Garrett's face as the footage reached 7:44, the moment Priya and I crossed the stage-left area together, her hand on my arm, her posture warm and attentive and entirely performed. The camera angle caught it cleanly. From that position looking inward, you could see Priya's left foot clearly, the deliberate outward extension, precisely timed, precisely placed. There was no ambiguity in the image, no interpretation that accommodated accident. The foot moved with intention, the way a trained eye recognizes intention. In a load-bearing calculation, the geometry was too exact for chance. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, more the collective exhalation of 60 people arriving simultaneously at an uncomfortable understanding. Near the edge of the crowd, I caught sight of Ren, standing beside an empty chair, her small hands pressed flat against her stomach, watching the screen with an expression far too old for 11. I hadn't seen her cross the room. I didn't know how long she'd been standing there, watching her mother's foot move across a screen in slow, undeniable motion. Watching 60 strangers understand what she'd already understood alone in a hallway 2 weeks earlier. That's... Garrett's voice broke off. His hand came up and pressed hard against his mouth, his eyes fixed on the screen with an expression of raw physical horror. The look of a man watching something he cannot unsee and knows he'll be seeing for a long time. That's not... He turned to Priya. Tell me that's not what it looks like. Priya's chin came up. Her eyes were bright and hard, and she held herself with the rigid composure of someone who had decided composure was the only weapon left. Garrett. Her voice had gone tight, controlled. Tell me right now that it's not what it looks like. Garrett held her gaze for 2 seconds. 3. His voice had gone rough and low in a way I hadn't heard since he was young enough to still ask me to leave the workshop light on against thunderstorms. She didn't answer. The silence she offered instead was its own answer, and it landed in Garrett's chest visibly. I watched it go in, watched his shoulders drop, watched the color leave his face until he looked suddenly much younger and much older at the same time. There is a second folder, Simone said quietly, her eyes moving once across the room before settling back on Priya. I think it's time we discussed what's in it. Harlan reached into the briefcase a second time, and Garrett, who hadn't moved from where he stood, looked at me across the table with eyes red and wet and devastated. Dad, he said so quiet I almost missed it beneath the noise of the room. What else don't I know? Harlan produced a thicker folder this time, more pages, more tabs, the color-coded organization that told me he'd been building this particular file for considerably longer than one evening. 18 months ago. Harlan said, his voice carrying the same level, unhurried quality it had maintained all evening. Miss Kessler retained two separate attorneys, one in Portland, one in Seattle, to explore legal mechanisms for challenging a trust beneficiary's controlling interest on grounds of diminished mental capacity. The room reacted not loudly, the crowd was too sophisticated for loud, but in the specific way of people who'd just heard something reorder everything they thought they understood about the evening. Garrett's head turned slowly toward Priya. The motion had a terrible deliberateness to it, like a man turning to look at something he already knew was going to hurt. Diminished mental capacity, Harlan continued, is a legal standard that, if established through medical evaluation and documented behavioral evidence, can be used to petition a court for removal of a person's authority over assets held in trust. It is a legitimate legal mechanism. It is also, in this instance, the framework Ms. Kessler has been constructing around your father for the past year and a half. Marcus leaned forward, his face stripped of its earlier composure. Are you saying she was building a case to have August declared incompetent? That is precisely what I'm saying, Harlan replied. The words sat in the room a moment before anyone moved. I felt something in my own chest that I hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication, not yet, but a kind of retroactive vertigo. The particular dizziness of understanding exactly how close I'd come to losing everything I'd spent 40 years protecting, without ever once seeing the mechanism that could have taken it. Priya's chin lifted. Her voice came out sharp, every word bitten off cleanly. That is a grotesque mischaracterization of a private legal consultation. The consultation stopped being private, Harlan said, after the second attorney involved decided the arrangement raised ethical concerns and documented it accordingly. He removed a 2-page letter from the folder and set it on the table. This is his written account dated 14 months ago. Priya's composure cracked, not collapsed, cracked. A hairline fracture running through the surface that her training almost managed to conceal. Almost. Her hands, perfectly still at her sides, closed into fists tight enough to whiten her knuckles. The party tonight, Simone said, her voice measured and precise, was intended as the final step. The footage of your father falling, which Ms. Kessler arranged, was meant to serve as documented behavioral evidence. An elderly man causing a scene at a formal corporate event, losing physical control, creating disruption. She paused. Footage that, edited and contextualized appropriately, could support a petition for a mental incapacity review. She knew the camera was running, Desmond said, his voice gone very cold. She counted on it. What she didn't account for, Harlan said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had set this piece in place years earlier and waited for exactly this moment, was the second camera. He said nothing further for a moment, letting the sentence sit in the room, the way he let every important sentence sit. Unhurried, certain, entirely unbothered by the silence stretching out around it. I had watched him do this for 22 years. I had never once seen it fail to land exactly where he intended. Harlan produced still frames from the folder, printed clear, unambiguous shot from the second camera, stationed near the production booth. The angle caught Priya's foot from a different position entirely. The timing, the placement, the deliberateness of it laid bare with nothing left for interpretation to soften. The frames went onto the table. Garrett looked at them for exactly 2 seconds before looking away, his jaw working violently, his eyes squeezing shut. Everything I did was to protect what we built. Priya's voice had shifted, the calculation dropping out of it, something more urgent and more real taking its place. You have to understand that. Your father was always going to be a liability to— Don't. Garrett's voice came out broken, barely above a whisper. Don't call him that. I was protecting our future. You were protecting your position. His voice fractured completely on the last word. He turned his body away from her, a gesture so final that 60 people saw it happen simultaneously. Then he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a folded set of papers I hadn't known he was carrying. Since we're presenting evidence tonight, he said, and his voice had gone strange, flat, controlled, in a way that cost him visibly to maintain. I have some of my own. The room's attention, which had been fixed entirely on Harlan and the trust documents, swung toward my son with a new kind of stillness. 10 days ago, Garrett said. I found a vendor in our financials called Agricultural Development Partners. It doesn't exist as a real business. It's a shell registered in Delaware that traces back through a holding company called Whitmore Strategic Holdings to a single beneficial owner. He looked at Priya directly for the first time since he'd started speaking. Your maiden name, Priya. 18 months of transfers, $40,000–$60,000 at a time, always under the board notification threshold. Priya went very still. I've had this for 10 days, Garrett said. I told myself I needed more proof. I told myself the timing was wrong. I was wrong about both of those things, and I'm done being wrong about you in front of people who trusted me to know better. Marcus was on his feet now, along with two other investors near the front. The particular urgent motion of people recalculating an entire evening's worth of financial assumptions in real time. I heard someone behind me murmur a question about the Series B filings, whether the numbers being presented to the board tomorrow would need to be pulled and restated before any capital could legally close. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone had already come out, held low, a lawyer already being texted. Priya's composure, which had survived the video and nearly survived the trust reveal, finally gave way entirely. Not loudly. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, hands at her sides, and I watched something drain out of her face that no amount of training could hold in place any longer. For the first time all evening, she looked less like a woman managing a crisis, and more like a woman standing at the edge of one she could no longer see the bottom of. Garrett, she said, whatever you think you found. I didn't think anything, he said. I confirmed it. 3 separate timelines. 11 wire transfers cross-checked against board minutes. I know exactly what I found, and I've known it for 10 days while you smiled at people across this room and told them how proud you were of everything we'd built together. His voice cracked on the last few words, and he pressed his lips together hard, fighting to keep whatever was rising in his chest from breaking free entirely in front of 60 strangers. Simone stepped forward, her voice cutting through with the particular authority of someone closing a door that had been left open far too long. Ms. Kessler, I am going to strongly recommend, for what I believe is the final time tonight, that you retain independent legal counsel before saying anything further, for your own protection as much as anyone else's. Priya didn't answer her. She was looking at Garrett, and something in her expression had shifted from calculation into something raw, something closer to fear than I'd seen from her all evening. Do you love me? Garrett asked. The room went electric. Someone near the back shifted in their chair, the sound carrying like a dropped pin through the held silence. It was, I would think later, the smallest question anyone had asked all evening, and it landed harder than anything in either folder. That's not a fair question right now, Priya said. It's the only question. His voice dropped to something almost private, though every one of the 60 people in that room heard it anyway. Everything else, the trust, the shares, the shell company, that's legal. That's for the board on Monday, but I'm asking you as your husband. Do you love me, or did you love what you thought I was going to become? Priya opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes moved down to the polished floor, to the chandeliers reflected back in broken gold pieces across the marble. She didn't answer. The room held that silence a long moment. Garrett standing with his shoulders squared and his eyes red-rimmed. Priya staring at a point somewhere past the back wall. The two of them separated by 3 feet of floor, and a distance that had clearly been widening for longer than either one of them had said out loud. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. Even the production booth had gone quiet, the technician's hands frozen above her board. Near the edge of the crowd, I saw Wren pressed against Desmond's side, one small fist gripping the fabric of his sleeve. Her face turned half away from the scene in front of her, as though watching it directly had become more than she could hold. Desmond's hand rested steady on her shoulder. He didn't try to move her or shield her from it entirely. He simply stood there, letting her decide how much of it she could bear to see. I stood watching my son absorb what he had just done. Publicly named his wife's fraud, publicly asked the only question that had ever actually mattered and received in return nothing but the sound of a room breathing around him. I didn't move toward him. I understood in the particular way you understand things about your own children without needing them explained, that this was not a moment for me to enter. It belonged to him, and I would only diminish it by stepping into it before he was ready to hand it to me. Garrett exhaled long and shaking audible across the whole room. He reached up and touched the knot of his tie, then let his hand drop. He turned away from Priya. He turned toward me. Harlan reached into the briefcase one final time and withdrew a single envelope, white-sealed. My son's name written across the front. In handwriting Garrett would have recognized anywhere. By 10 o'clock, the ballroom had become a different kind of room entirely. Not the room Priya had designed, not the curated seating, the three-tier photograph opportunities, the guest list built to make Garrett look like a man who had assembled his success from nothing but his own hands. That room was gone, dismantled piece by piece over the last 40 minutes by 2 folders and a video timestamp. What remained in its place was raw, quieter, and far more honest than anything that evening had originally intended to be. "Your father gave me this 7 years ago," Harlan said quietly, handing it to Garrett with both hands. "He asked me to hold it until the time was right." Garrett took it, and his fingers weren't steady, not slightly, but visibly. The fine tremor of a man operating at the outer edge of what he could hold together. He turned it over once, looking at his own name in my handwriting, and something in his face crumpled so fast and so completely that he had to press his lips together hard to keep it contained. "Do you want privacy?" Simone asked. Garrett shook his head, a single, unsteady motion. He broke the seal with his thumb and removed 2 pages of lined paper, folded in thirds, the kind that came from a yellow legal pad I'd kept in my study for longer than either of us could probably remember. He read it once through silently to himself. I watched his face while he read, because I had written those words, and I knew exactly where each one would land, and watching them arrive in him was one of the most painful things I had ever willingly done. His chin began to tremble by the second paragraph. By the end of the first page, his eyes were so full that the tears spilled over, whether he wanted them to or not, down both cheeks at once. Quiet. Unstoppable. The tears of a man who has run out of the resources required to hold them back. Desmond, who had been watching from where he stood, said quietly, "Read it out loud." Garrett looked up at him. Then he looked at me. His throat moved in a hard swallow, and then, with the particular courage of someone who understands that a thing witnessed by many carries more weight than a thing kept private, he unfolded the pages fully and began to read in a voice that shook from the first word and kept going anyway. "Garrett, if you're reading this, it means I was wrong to believe that time alone would be enough." He stopped, steadied his breath, kept going. "I'm not writing this to punish you. I'm writing it because I've been keeping a promise to your mother for years now. And promises have a way of running out if you wait too long to honor them properly. I never needed you to remember every sacrifice. That's not what sacrifice is for. What I needed, what I still need, is for you to remember this. A man's worth isn't the square footage of his office, or the name on his cap table, or the number of investors who bow when he walks into a room. I know you know that. I raised you to know it. What I don't know anymore is whether you still believe it, or whether somewhere along the way, you traded believing it for something that looked close enough to pass. I think about the day you drove up to my house with your 2-week paycheck stub still in your wallet, and a business plan you'd built alone at your kitchen table because you were afraid I'd say no if you asked before you had something real to show me. I think about how scared you were, and how much I loved you for being scared and building the plan anyway. That boy is still in you somewhere. I have to believe that, or none of what I built quietly around your company for the last 16 years means anything at all. Your mother used to say that a hive doesn't fail because the bees stop working. It fails because something in the structure stops protecting them without anyone noticing until it's too late to fix. I've thought about that more than I probably should since she's been gone. I've wondered whether the structures I built around you, the trust, the silence, the doors I opened without ever telling you my hand was on them, protected you the way I meant them to, or whether they were just another kind of hive wall keeping something out while quietly keeping something else in. His voice broke fully on the word 16, and he had to stop pressing the back of his hand hard against his mouth, breathing through his nose until he could continue. Nobody in that room moved. Nobody reached for a drink or shifted in a chair. 60 people stood entirely still, watching a man read a letter his father had written years before either of them had any idea it would end up being read aloud in a hotel ballroom in front of strangers. I looked once toward the edge of the crowd and found Wren still pressed against Desmond's side, no longer looking away. Something had shifted in her posture, some decision made about how much of this she was willing to witness, now that the worst of it seemed to be behind rather than ahead of her. Her eyes were fixed on her father, wide and wet and entirely unguarded, the way only a child's face can be in a room full of adults still practicing theirs. The day you treat another human being as less than human because of what they wear, or where they come from, or what they drive, that's the day you've lost something no amount of money will ever buy back. I've watched you get close to that day more than once these last few years, and each time I told myself it was the culture, the pressure, the version of success everyone around you seems to be selling. I don't know anymore if that's true or if I was just protecting myself from having to say something harder. I love you. Not the version of you that closes deals or gets quoted in trade magazines. The boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the long drive home from the county fair. The young man who called me crying the night your mother's hydrangeas bloomed for the first time after she was gone because you said it felt wrong that something so beautiful kept happening without her there to see it. That person is worth any amount of waiting. I hope by the time you read this you agree. Garrett's voice gave out entirely on the last line. He lowered the pages and his face was wet, and he made no move to address it, no hand raised to his cheek, no controlled recovery. He simply stood there in the middle of what had been supposed to be the biggest night of his professional life, holding his father's handwriting in his hands and let the whole room see exactly what those words had done to him, without once trying to make it smaller than it was. Wren had moved from her table at some point during the reading. She stood 20 feet away, small hands clasped in front of her navy dress, her face carrying an expression far too old for 11. The expression of a child who loves two people and has been watching them hurt each other, and is desperately hoping this is the moment it stops. Garrett looked at his daughter. His voice came out destroyed and barely audible. Wren, sweetheart. She crossed the 20 feet at a run and hit him around the middle with both arms, and Garrett Kessler, CEO, 44 years old, master of the controlled impression, bent over his daughter and cried in a way that had nothing managed about it at all. I stood near the edge of the platform, my knees still throbbing beneath the torn fabric of my jacket, and I did not move toward either of them. Some part of me wanted to. A larger part of me understood that this moment belonged entirely to the two of them, and that stepping into it, even with the gentlest intentions, would have made it about me in some small way. It had no business being about. Understand something about that moment, because I never told anyone the full truth of it. Not that night, not since. Watching my son fold around his daughter in front of 60 strangers, I felt something in my chest that had been wound tight for so long I'd stopped recognizing it as tension at all. I'd simply started calling it my chest, the way you stop noticing the weight of something you've carried every day for years. And in that moment, without deciding to, without any conscious thought behind it, my right hand went into my jacket pocket and closed around the small metal hive tool I'd carried in there since Dottie's funeral, the one with her initials worn nearly smooth against the handle. I didn't take it out. I didn't look down at it. I stood perfectly still, my hand closed around a piece of metal shaped for prying apart hive boxes, and let it hold whatever I didn't have anywhere else to put. My throat had closed so completely that if someone had asked me a direct question in that moment, I don't believe I could have answered it. There is a thing I have never said to Garrett, and I don't know that I ever will. Some part of me had suspected Priya long before that Tuesday phone call about the launch, not the fraud, not the specifics, but something in the way she'd looked at me across our first Thanksgiving table. Something in the particular attentiveness she brought to rooms that mattered, and the particular absence of it in rooms that didn't. I'd noticed it the way you notice a hairline crack in a beam you're not yet ready to condemn. And I'd said nothing for years, telling myself it wasn't my place. telling myself Garrett was a grown man, entitled to his own judgment, telling myself a dozen reasonable things that all amounted to the same choice I'd made my whole life whenever something frightened me enough. I stayed quiet. I watched. I let the structure hold or fail on its own, the way I'd let Roy's structure fail on me 40 years earlier. Except this time, I'd had the chance to say something, and hadn't. I have turned that over more times than I can count since that night, trying to decide whether staying quiet had been wisdom or cowardice wearing wisdom's clothes. I still don't have a clean answer. I suspect I never will. A man can spend his whole life building careful structures to protect the people he loves and still, in the end, fail to protect them from the one thing he could see coming and chose not to name out loud. That wound doesn't close just because the truth finally came out in a ballroom. I want to be honest about that telling this now. Some things you carry get lighter. Some things just get more familiar to carry, which isn't the same as healing, no matter how much easier it becomes to walk with them. The clock on the far wall read 10:22 when the LED screen above the stage finally went dark. 60 people sat, without moving, without speaking, without so much as reaching for their water glasses. The footage had ended 30 seconds earlier, but nobody seemed to understand yet that the moment itself was over. Because it wasn't, not really. It was still spreading through the room the way a crack spreads through ice, quiet, unstoppable, patient, in a way that felt almost merciful. Somewhere behind me, a chair leg scraped softly against the floor, as someone finally shifted their weight. The first small sound in what had felt like a full minute of held breath. Harlan stood 2 steps to my right. His briefcase closed now, both hands folded over the latch. Simone remained near the podium, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes sweeping the room the way a lighthouse sweeps a dark harbor, steady, offering mercy to no one in particular. Garrett stood in the middle of it all, Ren still wrapped around his waist, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie hanging loose. For the first time in years, he looked exactly like the boy who used to crawl into my workshop at midnight, afraid of thunderstorms, asking me to leave the light on. Priya stood 3 feet to his left, her jaw set like something poured, and hardened her fingers wrapped around her clutch bag so tightly the knuckles had gone bloodless. She kept her eyes forward. She did not look at Garrett. She did not look at me. She stared at a point somewhere past the back wall as though she could will herself out of that room through sheer refusal to acknowledge it. I wondered, watching her, whether she had ever once imagined this exact ending when she'd first started building whatever she'd been building, or whether people who construct things like that never really let themselves picture the moment the structure comes down around them. Nobody moved to comfort her. Nobody moved to condemn her either. The room simply held her at the particular distance a crowd reserves for someone they've collectively decided has forfeited the right to be reached toward. And I found watching her stand alone inside that distance that I felt nothing like triumph. Only the deep-settled tiredness of something long overdue finally arriving. Desmond caught my eye once across the room, a small nod that carried no words with it and needed none. Marcus was already speaking, low, with 2 other investors. The particular hushed urgency of men calculating what Monday's board session would mean for their own positions. Simone had begun moving quietly among the tables nearest the stage, gathering the loose threads of an evening that had stopped resembling anything on its original program roughly 40 minutes earlier. I looked down at my hand still closed around the hive tool in my pocket and thought about Dottie, and about a promise I'd kept in exactly the wrong way for exactly the wrong reasons, and about how some structures only reveal what they were actually built to protect once the weight finally comes all the way down. 4 days after the Marchmont, I stood at my kitchen counter in Hood River, pouring a second cup of coffee when I heard the sound of tires on gravel, slow and deliberate, coming up the driveway. The days between had moved the way days move after something enormous happens, too fast in some places, unbearably slow in others. Monday's emergency board session had gone almost exactly the way Harlan predicted. Garrett's executive authority was suspended, pending a full governance review, a formality more than a punishment, the kind of pause a company takes to make certain the ground beneath it is actually solid before it lets anyone keep building on it. Simone told me privately that the suspension would likely lift within 60 days provided full cooperation, and I believed her the way you believe someone whose entire professional life has been built on not saying things she doesn't mean. Priya did not contest the board's findings. Her attorney reached out to Harlan 2 days after the launch to say she wouldn't fight the governance review, and a separation agreement was already being drafted by the end of that week. I don't know everything that happened between Garrett and her in the days after the ballroom, and I didn't ask for details beyond what he offered. He told me only that he'd asked her to leave the house the night they drove home from Portland, and that he hadn't heard much from her since beyond what passed through lawyers. I set the coffee mug down on the counter, my hand steadier than it had been in days, and looked out the window above the sink. The one that faces the front yard. The one Dottie used to lean against every morning in her housecoat, coffee in hand, checking on her hydrangeas like they were children she was responsible for. The hydrangeas were bare now, brown and skeletal in the last cold snap of the season, stripped down to their bones the way this part of Oregon strips everything, eventually. I'd wrapped the bases with burlap the way she'd shown me 20 years earlier, pressing my thumbs into the knots the way she used to press hers. They'd come back in May, the same as always. They always did. Garrett's car at his own, not the company Audi with the Cascade Bloom plate on the front, pulled up and stopped just short of the garage. The engine cut. A beat of quiet. Then the rear door swung open before the car had even fully settled, and Wren came flying out of the back seat at a dead sprint, sneakers scattering gravel, her coat unzipped and flapping wide behind her, like she'd decided somewhere on the drive that cold weather was a suggestion she wasn't interested in following. "Grandpa." I pushed through the front door and she hit me like a small freight train, both arms locking around my waist, her face buried hard into my flannel shirt. I wrapped my arms around her and held on. And I didn't pretend, not even for a second, that my eyes weren't going hot and blurring immediately. I blinked hard and pressed my cheek against the top of her head and breathed in the scent of her shampoo. Something sweet, floral, 11 years old, and something that had been wound tight in my chest since Friday night. Something I hadn't even realized I was still carrying finally began to come loose. "Hey, baby girl." I managed my voice rougher than I intended. "You're gonna knock me clean off this porch." She pulled back just far enough to look up at me, her eyes fierce and bright, and suspiciously wet at the corners. "Good," she said. "You need somebody to knock you around a little. You've been out here alone too long, and it's not okay. I told Dad that on the way here, and I'm telling you now." I laughed. It came out fuller and rougher than I expected. More laughter than I'd produced in months. Honest laughter. The kind that starts in your chest and surprises you on the way out. "You told him that," I said. "Twice," she said, still holding on. "He agreed both times." Garrett came up the porch steps with both hands deep in his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly rounded against the cold. He looked different than he had at the Marchmont. Not fixed, nothing broken across 16 years gets fixed in 4 days, and I'd lived long enough to stop expecting miracles on that kind of timeline. But lighter. Like he'd finally set something down that he'd been carrying in the wrong position for years, something that had been pulling at his spine without him quite noticing until the moment he put it on the ground. He stopped at the top step and looked at me over Wren's head. "I should have come sooner," he said. His voice was quiet, carrying no performance in it whatsoever. "Not just this week. I mean years ago, Dad. I should have been driving up this road a lot more than I was." "You're here now," I said. "That counts for more than you think." He exhaled long and unsteady and stepped forward. I reached out with my free arm and pulled him in, Wren still tucked against my other side, and for a moment the three of us stood together on that old wooden porch in the gray morning cold, and I held my son and my granddaughter, and I didn't say a single word. Because some moments don't need language. They just need weight. They just need presence. I thought about Dottie. I thought about how she used to stand in this exact doorway some mornings, this same threshold, this same worn wood under her slippers, waiting for Garrett to pull up after a long drive home from college. How she'd leave the porch light burning, even when he wasn't due until well past midnight. He needs to see it from the driveway, she'd say, whenever I suggested turning it off to save the bulb. He needs to know somebody's still up. He needs to know this is still his home. I'd left that porch light on every single night since the day we buried her. 9 years of mornings where I'd wake and see it still glowing in the pale dawn light and tell myself it was just habit. 9 years of telling myself that. But standing there now with both of them pressed against me, I understood it had never been habit at all. Garrett pulled back first. His eyes were wet, and he wasn't fighting it anymore. The jaw wasn't tight. The throat wasn't working against itself. He let it be what it was. Simone called this morning, he said. Board's confirmed Monday's review timeline is on track. She said the suspension should lift by mid-January, assuming full cooperation on my end. He paused, dragged a breath. Priya's attorney reached out to Harlan yesterday, too. She's not contesting the board's findings. They're drafting the separation agreement. Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay, Dad, that's significant. That means she's... I know what it means. I put my hand firmly on his shoulder and felt him steady under it. And we'll face all of it. Every piece of it together the right way. One Monday at a time. I looked down at Wren, who had pulled back just far enough to look up at me with Dottie's eyes. Same shape, same particular shade of brown, same expression of someone who understood more than she was saying. What I have right now, I told her, is hot coffee on the counter, and there's a tin of your grandmother's honey shortbread in the back of the freezer that I've been saving since last fall because I couldn't quite bring myself to eat it alone. Wren's whole face transformed. The worry dissolved, and something pure and uncomplicated took its place. A grin so wide it scrunched the bridge of her nose and pushed up into her eyes. Grandma's honey shortbread, she said, already moving. The very ones. The very ones. She made 3 dozen the fall before she passed, and I froze them, and I've been guarding them like they were classified documents. Wren grabbed my hand with both of hers and started pulling me toward the kitchen door, with the full conviction of an 11-year-old who has decided exactly where she needs to be. I let her pull me. I let her set the pace and lead the way, and I followed her through the door and into the warmth of the kitchen, where the coffee was still hot and the windows were fogged faintly at the edges from the cold outside. Garrett stepped in behind us and held the door. As I crossed the threshold, I reached over with my free hand and clicked off the porch light. There is something I never told my son standing on that porch, and I don't know that I ever will. Some part of me had seen Priya clearly a long time before that Tuesday phone call about the launch. Not the specifics, not the fraud, but something underneath it, some hairline crack I'd noticed and decided wasn't mine to point at. I let that silence stand for years, the same silence I'd built my whole life around, and it had nearly cost both of us everything before it finally broke open in a room full of strangers. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself fully for the years I stayed quiet, when a single honest sentence, spoken early enough, might have spared him some of what he carried alone into that ballroom. Some wounds don't get to close just because the story around them finds its way to a good ending. They just find a quieter place to sit. I have thought a great deal in the time since about the questions I used to ask myself, without ever quite answering them. Whether protecting someone by disappearing into the structure around them was really protection at all, or just another way of failing to show up. I don't have a clean answer, even now, and I suspect a man my age is entitled to stop expecting one. What I have instead is this: my son standing in my kitchen, with his daughter pulling honey shortbread out of the freezer, both of them laughing about something I hadn't caught the beginning of the porch light finally dark behind us, because we didn't need it anymore. Everybody was home. That morning, standing in my own kitchen, beside the people who never abandoned me, I understood something that had taken me more than 70 years to learn. Real love doesn't demand attention. It doesn't compete for applause or wait for the perfect moment to announce itself. It arrives quietly, when a life falls apart, offers a steady hand, and stays long after everyone else has already gone home. I poured Wren a glass of milk without her having to ask for it, the way I used to pour one for Garrett at that same counter 30-some years ago. And I found myself thinking that some rituals don't need reinventing. They only need someone willing to keep them going a little longer than seems strictly necessary. The hydrangeas came back in May the same as always. I stood at that same kitchen window one morning and watched Wren kneel in the dirt beside them, patient, in a way children rarely are, pressing a single honeybee gently back onto a blossom after it had tumbled dazed onto the porch step. She didn't flinch when it landed on her finger. She just waited still as stone until it found its footing and flew on its own toward the orchard rows beyond the fence. For most of my life, I believed that protecting the people I loved meant standing quietly outside the frame, holding the structure together, from a place they couldn't see. So nothing I carried could ever become a weight they had to carry too. I thought that was strength. I have come to understand it was closer to fear wearing strength's clothes. A structure built entirely in silence protects nothing if the people inside it never learn they were ever at risk. Love that hides itself to spare someone else isn't absence of love. But it isn't the whole of it either. It is only half a promise kept in the dark, waiting for a day it might finally be allowed to stand in the light. Some nights I still sit with that Tuesday morning at 34. And some nights I sit instead with a porch light finally going dark. Both of them are true. Both of them, by the grace of God, brought me here. I've thanked God more than once these past months, not for the fall, not for any of what it cost us, but for a granddaughter brave enough to whisper a warning, for a son brave enough to read a letter out loud, and for whatever mercy of God's timing put both of them in that room before it was too late to matter, before silence had the chance to finish what it started. If you were standing where I stood, holding real power to protect the people you love, but knowing that using it openly might cost you the very thing you were protecting, would you have stayed silent as long as I did? Would you have told them sooner? Or would fear have kept you exactly where it kept me, watching from a careful distance and calling it love? Tell me honestly in the comments below where you'd have drawn that line, and where you think it should have been drawn instead. If this story found something true in you, share it with someone who's been carrying a structure alone for too long. And if you're staying with us, I'll be glad to see you again next time.